Hello, and welcome to another video from your friends here at the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. Today, we're very excited to start a new video series featuring recipients of our Learning from Elections grants. The grants were designed to bring both new scientific insights and practical guidance for election administrators around the country, and today we're very pleased to welcome a few members of one of these research teams. John Carey, who serves as Associate Dean of Faculty for the Social Sciences at Dartmouth College and is the John Wentworth Professor in the Social Sciences there, as well as Jason Reifler, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to the lab's founding director, Charles Stewart.
Thanks, Claire. And it's John and Jason. It's great to have you all here today. So let's just jump into a discussion of the project that you're doing as part of our Learning from Elections project, which has to do with voter and election fraud. Before we get into the actual findings that y'all have, what brought y'all to this topic of voter and election fraud?
I'll start. If we think back really even to 2016, we've seen kind of a sea change, I think, in certainly in candidate behavior, and it really, it started most prominently with Donald Trump, of candidates basically saying, "I'm not sure I'm going to accept the election results if I lose," and pointing to fraud as, to making allegations of widespread fraud as the reason for that. And that, of course, has changed our politics fundamentally. That was, on the table most prominently, I guess, after the 2020 presidential election. But this discussion is it's new. We've been having it intensely enough now for long enough that we might forget that it's really pretty new to our politics. And so this particular project we're talking about today is part of a longer project that started around the 2020 election, really motivated by those discussions in 2016 and during Trump's term around fraud and the legitimacy of elections.
And I think I just would like to add to that, in addition to the sort of critical normative importance of safeguarding democracy and making sure that our democratic institutions are protected, that for me, this also dovetails with a long-standing focus on correcting misperceptions broadly. So when people have beliefs about the world that are incorrect, how successful are attempts to try and correct people's misperceptions? Are there variation in how different approaches work or not? Do these corrections backfire and actually make people double down when they're given corrective information? How long do corrections last? And do they affect other attitudes? Do they just seem to affect people's ability to correctly answer survey questions about whether something is true or false?
Right. And so, as I believe John was mentioning, I mean, this is part of a kind of a larger project in these issues. With this particular research that you're doing, supported by the Election Lab, I mean, what has been the focus of your research? And you can maybe even just get into the weeds a little bit. What are the sorts of things that y'all have done to conduct the research?
So this most recent round was focused around the 2022 midterm elections. And, so the point of departure, I guess, is that we see high fraud beliefs, particularly among Republican voters and partisans, lower among Democrats coming out of the 2020 election. We wanted to assess the effectiveness of a couple of different strategies to try to correct misperceptions about how prevalent fraud is and how much confidence people ought to have in election administration. And we think of those two as one being a kind of a retrospective correction based on sort of looking back at past events and having what we hope would be credible sources saying, actually, you might have thought that there were fraud problems, but there were not. So because fraud beliefs are greater among Republicans than among Democrats, we are having prominent Republican office holders, Republican appointed judges, Republican sources referring back to the 2020 election and saying, hey, these allegations that we associate with the big lie, they don't stand up. The other approach was more forward-looking, and we can think of that as a kind of inoculation type of effect that sort of says, you might hear some things about the 2022 election, and we're here to tell you that some of these rumors and allegations are not correct. So we tried both approaches around this, around both leading up to the 2022 election and in the immediate aftermath. It was a 3-wave set of survey experiments. Jason, you can fill in what I've left unsaid there.
Yeah, so I also want to add in a little bit of the importance of why doing this in 2022 was really crucial, in addition to work that we were building on from 2020, is that we expected a very, very different electoral environment. So in 2020, it's Biden winning the presidency, and this is the genesis of a lot of the voter fraud claims and January 6th and all of these very frightening things about the security of democracy. But 2022, especially 6 to 9 months out, looked like it would be a very different political environment in which it was Democrats who were much more likely to fare poorly at the polls. And so concerns over whether Democrats would sort of uptake and share these same types of beliefs, particularly around voter fraud or irregular elections, or particularly in response to Republican efforts to change electoral rules, especially in Republican states, and if that happened, whether efforts to try and correct these misperceptions would be equally effective among Democrats and Republicans as they may seem. Now, as it turns out, it wasn't as strong a Republican year as we expected 3, 6, 9 months out. And I think we all can pinpoint the exact day where the election likely changed. But that was an important sort of part of the setup and why 2022 was so crucial, in addition to these mechanism things that John was talking about, whether backwards looking or forward looking, or whether things are, when they're forward looking, have a sort of inoculation warning that people are going to try and mislead you, or just the corrective information without such a warning would be effective.
And what did you find?
So the good news, I guess, is both approaches get some traction. And, so we asked a bunch of outcome questions, or, we measured a bunch of outcome effects. One I referred to as just confidence that the election was clean and the results were legitimate. And we asked that at different levels. Do you think your vote was counted properly? Do you think votes in your local area were counted properly? Do you think your state was good? And do you think the nation was good? And both approaches actually increase confidence across those levels. We asked about a bunch of questions about specific types of fraud: people impersonating someone else, non-citizens voting, people voting multiple times, people tampering with ballots, people tampering with software, all the different manifestations of fraud that are alleged out there that we know are rare. And again, both mitigate beliefs in how widespread those types of fraud are. So that's all good. I think on the margin, the sort of fact-based delivering the basic facts worked a little bit better than the retrospective. I think that shows up more in how persistent the effects were. In other words, so we ask people and we expose them to the treatment, and then we measure the outcomes. That's an immediate effect, but we also conducted follow-up waves, sort of 6 weeks later and 9 weeks later, or something like that. I can't remember the exact gaps. Those fact-based ones, I think, had a little bit more traction down the road. But the good news is they were both pretty effective. I don't think it wasn't clearly a knockout victory for one approach or the other.
Yeah. So looking forward to 2024, and you kind of touched on this, but maybe to be explicit about it, people watching this video are thinking, okay, now we have an election coming up. So if you were to give advice to election officials, state, local, about how to prepare for 24, how to communicate with voters, just to start with, well, what should they do? And then I'm going to come back to ask whether this research or other research suggests approaches that may not be effective or may in fact backfire. But why don't we start with the positive message? How should election officials be thinking about communicating with the public moving forward? And actually, I'm going to call on Jason, since John has been going first so far.
Yeah, so I think that the sort of the central communication lesson is that clear, authoritative, factual information is able to move on the margins, doesn't move everybody, it doesn't have gigantically large effect sizes, but improves people's ability to discern real from false claims. And this does seem to increase people's confidence in elections. So just clearly repeating all the ways in which elections are safe and secure, using the same types of resources that we used from CISA to create our informational treatments, where available, having people on hand who can be the unexpected sources or credible sources that John was talking about. So Republicans who are willing to state on the record that elections are safe and secure and this wasn't fraud, if it's Republicans who are claiming fraud, and the same on the Democratic side if it's Democratic politicians who are claiming fraud. There's one, I think, really interesting wrinkle that a lot of the time in misperceptions research that we might take as a negative, that I think in the particular case of an election administration, where it's probably good faith, neutral civil servants who are trying to administer the cornerstone of democracy fairly and impartially, is that these efforts to correct the misperception, they increase the support or confidence in elections, but they don't seem to have any spillover to decreasing the affect that people might have towards people who are making false claims or changing people's underlying political preferences. That the effects seem to be really limited to the misperceptions themselves. And in other domains, we might want correcting misperceptions to spill over to some sort of behavioral or policy preference change in a sort of broad normative sense. But for election administration, I think it's actually a positive thing that maybe that's not happening, because then my guess would be, and you will know election administration officials better than I will, that this will make them feel much more confident in being able to communicate this, in that it really is a message about the safeguarding democracy and isn't a partisan message. They will be attacked for it being a partisan message, but that's not how people are receiving it. And I think that our work and our evidence can be a nice support for that.
Yeah. So, I mean, is this are these the sort of communications? I'm saying the experiments you did, or you imagine what could be effective. Do you have to have kind of fancy equipment or kind of fancy production values to get this information out? Kind of what's your sense about the nature of production values, and is it useful just to have a kind of the local election official just kind of talking naturally? Do you think they need to invest heavily in PR firms to give fancy videos? What's your sense about this from your experience?
John, I'm happy to answer, but John, do you want to take it?
I'll take a crack. I would say the good news is what we delivered was very kind of nerdy and in the weeds. So we didn't create the content of the treatments ourselves. We wanted to take information that was out there in the natural environment. And so we concatenated information from the CISA website. CISA is a Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Administration. I believe it's part of the Department of Homeland Security. The point being, there was no sort of visual pyrotechnics. There was nothing fancy about it. These were kind of very much in the weeds, bullet point kinds of information about the way ballots are handled, the way that drop boxes are secured. This is the kind of information that electoral officials are, this is what the sea they swim in. And so they are eminently prepared or able to deliver exactly that kind of information. And the good news is that was the information that performed the best in our experiments. So I think that's good news.
Yeah.
If I can, I'll just add slightly on top of that. I think that conditional on being exposed to a message, that whether it's sort of low tech, just simple interview with an election official on the local news versus super high production value, I don't think there's going to be a lot of difference there. I think a slightly different question is, do things like production value change how viral information can be, or changes the likelihood of people being exposed to it? But conditional on exposure, I think there would be very, very minimal effects of things like production value. So I don't think huge sums of money need to be put into this kind of stuff. And I'm not sure that, it's beyond my area of expertise to, whether production values change how wide or how easily it might spread or how likely it is to show up in somebody's overall information environment, whether that's TV or online or through interpersonal communication because somebody else saw it. But my guess is even effects there would also be relatively small.
Which I'll just underscore, is really good news because as we know, the typical election office is a one-person operation, maybe a two-person operation, and chronically underfunded. And what I'm taking away from this discussion and what I've read and seen presented of your research is that you don't need a big communication staff. What you need to be doing though is you need to be reaching out to news organizations, talking to the public, being fact-based. If you can have respected politicians and others in the community actually kind of communicate against interest, as we call it, Republicans talking to Republicans, Democrats talking to Democrats, then that's the important thing to do, and anybody can do that. Is what I take away from that. Well, we're running to the end of the time, and I just wanted to give y'all an opportunity to say anything from your research that hasn't been said and that you would like folks to hear.
I guess just the last thing I'll note is keep at it, because the effects do mitigate over time, but they seem to be, replenishable as well. And so, it requires some stamina and persistence, and maybe repeating talking points, because you want to make sure that keep the message fresh.
Well, great. Well, we will have links to your research and others' research down below, and we hope folks will take a look at that and be in touch with you all, or be in touch with us to learn more. So back to you, Claire.
Thanks, Charles. And thanks to both of you for joining us. Thanks to everyone watching out there. If you would like to learn more about the research we discussed today, as Charles said, there will be links in the description box below. If you'd like to be notified the next time one of our videos goes live, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And until next time, keep talking elections.